A shepherd found old railroad tracks in the tundra. No one knew why they were there or where they led. But when he reached the end of the line, he realized the truth had been buried for decades. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The cold always came quietly on the southern edge of the Alaskan tundra, like a slow and patient hunter. It crept under doors, curled around sleeping bodies, and pressed its teeth against exposed skin with the same certainty as the sun rising and the seasons turning. For Caleb Walker, cold was not an enemy or even a hardship anymore. It was simply the background music of life, a low, constant note that made the warmth of a stove or the steam from a mug feel like small celebrations of survival. His ranch had never looked more fragile than it did that winter. Every fence post groaned. Every wall of the weather-beaten barn leaned inward as if trying to hold on against time and win. The animals clustered together, fur thick and warm, but their ribs too visible beneath. A few muskox and a scattering of tough, stubborn reindeer were all that he could still care for. Predators were bold that year. Wolves had circled twice in the past month, and Caleb had chased them off with warning shots into the night sky, watching their sleek shapes melt into darkness, only to return later with fiercer hunger. Bills piled on the kitchen table inside the house, each envelope stamped and stark and unfriendly. Late notices, warnings, a bank letter that still lay unopened because he already knew exactly what it said. If Winter didn't take his animals first, the creditors would. He tried not to think about selling the ranch, but the thought pressed to the front of his mind more often lately, an intrusive whisper that sounded a bit like defeat. He stood outside now, gloved hands deep in the pockets of his heavy jacket, watching his small herd shift uneasily in the biting afternoon wind. The sky was the gray of tarnished metal, featureless and heavy. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a low weather system was dragging its frozen breath across miles of wilderness toward him. He should have been tightening shelters, checking fences, maybe clearing the roof of the shed before the storm hit. Instead, his thoughts drifted where they always drifted when he felt cornered, to his grandfather. Samuel Walker had raised him after his parents' accident. The old man had been a creature forged by the land itself, quiet, sharp-eyed, quick to laugh but quicker to silence if conversation veered too close to the past. He'd served in the military, though the specifics had never been shared openly. Caleb remembered nights when Samuel's hands would tremble slightly as he lit his pipe, and his gaze would wander not to the fire, but somewhere far beyond it, into a distance only he could see. The old house still held those ghosts, tucked into corners and etched onto wooden surfaces by time and memory. One story always came back to Caleb most clearly, the story that had once kept him from wandering too far from home. When he was still young enough to believe in monsters but old enough to ask questions, Samuel told him that the tundra hid things better left alone. He spoke of rails buried beneath snowdrifts that led to places where people vanished. He told Caleb that if he ever found a piece of old railroad out in the wild, he should turn back, no matter how curious he felt, because the trains that ran there had never been meant to return. Back then, Caleb had shivered at the tale, imagining something like a ghost train full of faceless shadows. As he grew older, he dismissed it as a method of keeping a child close to home and far from the dangers of the wilderness. It had worked for years, but now, standing alone in the wind, the memory of that warning didn't feel childish anymore. It felt like a knot tightening just beneath his ribs. He exhaled, the breath trailing from his mouth like smoke, and forced himself to stand straighter. Work first, worry later. He walked toward the slope behind the barn where an old wooden feed trough sat, half collapsed under its own weight. The ground here dropped off into a shallow hollow before rising into a series of low hills that stretched like the crouched backs of frozen beasts. The snow was deeper today, and as he trudged forward, his boots sank in farther than he expected. Then the land beneath him shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle give, a small collapse of crusted snow and brittle earth. He froze, instinctively steadying himself. Beneath the surface, something groaned with a metallic echo. The sound was faint but unmistakable. He took a cautious step back and crouched, brushing snow aside with his gloves. Dark metal gleamed from the exposed gap, a straight line, Smooth, rusted, but deliberately shaped. A rail. Caleb blinked, not immediately understanding. He scraped away more snow. The metal continued forward in a perfect line, disappearing beneath the white blanket. He shifted his focus to the other side, brushing, pushing, uncovering. A second rail, parallel to the first, connected by what remained of old wooden ties, cracked and splintered by decades of frost. His fingers paused on the cold iron. Disbelief arrived first, followed quickly by a pulse of unease that crawled upward from his stomach. There shouldn't be any rails here. The nearest active railroad was hundreds of miles south, and even the old mining lines had been dismantled generations ago. There was no record, no rumor, no explanation for a track this deep in the wilderness. No explanation except one. Grandpa Samuel's voice returned to him, low and grave, like a warning carried through time. If you ever find rails out there, boy, turn back. A gust of wind cut across Caleb's face, as if nature itself wanted to hurry him along, to push him away. But he didn't move. His heart hammered harder, alternating with a strange and stubborn excitement. Fear and curiosity battled inside his chest, and curiosity was winning by inches. He straightened and looked to the horizon. The rails continued on, a straight path cutting through nothingness, disappearing into hills and silence. If he followed them, what would he find? Abandoned machinery? A collapsed mine shaft? Old American infrastructure lost to time? Or something darker? He tried to laugh at himself, but the sound died before it left his throat. When he turned back toward the house, the familiar outline of the barn and home seemed suddenly small. Too small to hold answers, too small to distract him from what now lay beneath the snow. He didn't return inside right away. Instead, he walked the tracks a little farther, brushing snow aside occasionally just to prove they didn't suddenly stop. The rails remained steady, purposeful, and ancient. Each new glimpse into their direction seemed to tug him along, urging him to see where they began or ended. By the time he forced himself to stop, dusk was already gathering, the world dimming to ash and silver. The air turned sharper. He felt the familiar pinch of cold sinking into his bones. He trudged back home, though his thoughts remained behind, stretched thin between him and that buried steel. Inside, he set water on the stove and peeled off his gloves with restless fingers. The dog, a tired old mutt named Jasper, lifted his head in lazy acknowledgement, but didn't move from the rug. Caleb looked at him and almost confessed out loud what he'd found, like a secret too heavy to carry alone. Instead, he buried his hands in his pockets and stared at the kitchen table. The letters seemed to mock him from their pile. Past due, overdue, immediate action required. He rubbed a hand over his face. What did he have left to lose? If the ranch slipped through his fingers, he would have nothing but the clothes on his back and the ghosts of memories to follow. His gaze drifted to the old wooden box on the top shelf near the pantry. It had belonged to his grandfather. Caleb hadn't opened it since the funeral. Now, drawn by something deeper than intention, he took it down and set it on the table. The brass latch opened with a reluctant click. Inside, wrapped in a folded handkerchief, lay a tarnished military dog tag. A faded photograph. Samuel as a young man, standing in a line of uniformed soldiers in front of what looked like a temporary camp structure. Snow covered the ground in the picture. The building behind them looked eerily similar to the low, flat roofs he'd glimpsed in the distance from the hill earlier. His breath caught. He lifted the photo closer, noticing now that several faces in the background had been carelessly scratched out by someone's fingernail, as if the very act of remembering them was forbidden. A small, cracked notebook sat beneath the picture. When he flipped through it, he found short notes, clipped phrases, coordinates, and names that meant nothing to him. No explanations, no context, just proof that Samuel had been part of something unspeakable. Caleb sat with the box open before him, the storm tapping on the windows as night folded over the land. A thought curled slowly through his mind, a sharp and dangerous idea. Those rails were not a coincidence, not forgotten debris. They were part of what his grandfather had feared, part of the reason he had held so many secrets behind locked eyes and choked silence. The stove whistled, breaking his trance. He poured water into a chipped mug, but the tea remained untouched on the table as he stared into the dark. He could ignore the rails. Pretend they were none of his concern. Patch the fence tomorrow. Fight another day to keep the life he had left. Pretend that stories were just stories, and ghosts belonged only to memory. But if he walked away, the rails would remain there, whispering under the snow, waiting for someone else to follow them. Someone without his grandfather's warnings. Someone who wouldn't understand the danger until it was too late. He clenched his hands slowly, decision tightening around his chest like a band. Tomorrow he would prepare. Supplies, warmer clothes, a reliable map, a camera. He couldn't go blind into the unknown. But he would go. He looked again at his grandfather's picture, at the half-smile frozen in grainy monochrome. There had been so much pain behind that smile. Caleb had never known the full weight of it until now. The old man had been trying to protect him, but he'd also been waiting for someone to finish the story, to uncover what had been buried. Caleb stood and walked to the nearest window. Out there, beyond his breath on the glass, stretched a world that wanted its truth hidden. Somewhere under snow and silence, steel rails waited to be followed. They pointed toward a past America had chosen to forget. He wasn't sure whether he felt brave or foolish. Maybe it didn't matter. The cold outside pressed closer, like a reminder that dawn would come quickly. Soon he would walk the same direction the rails did, step after step, deeper into the land his grandfather feared. Tonight, however, he allowed himself one more moment of knowing comfort. He reached down and scratched Jasper's fur as the dog leaned into him, half asleep. Then he switched off the lights and stood in the doorway of his bedroom for a long second, listening to the wind. The rails should not have been there, but they were, and tomorrow he would find out why. Morning came with a pale, ghost-like light that seeped slowly into the world, turning the frosted windows of Caleb's home into sheets of silver. The wind had quieted during the night, and the stillness felt expectant, as if the tundra itself held its breath. Caleb lay awake for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his decision settle deeper into his chest. There would be no turning back from this choice. He sensed that even before he swung his legs from the bed and set his feet on the cold wooden floor. Down in the kitchen, Jasper lifted his head as Caleb moved about the room, gathering supplies. The old dog's eyes were cloudier these days, but intelligence still flickered behind them, a silent question hanging there. Caleb forced a reassuring pat to the dog's head, though part of him wondered if he was trying to reassure himself more. He packed food, extra water, thermal blankets, his camera, a portable power bank, and last night's discoveries, a few photographs from his grandfather's box and the dog tag, which he tucked into his jacket as though Samuel's memory might ward off whatever waited ahead. He filled the thermos with scalding black coffee, letting the heat soak into his palms. Already the tension in his shoulders urged him to delay, to postpone, to think this through one more time. The house smelled of old wood and brewing coffee, familiar comforts that begged him to stay. But he couldn't. To stay would mean burying the truth again, just as the snow had buried those rails for decades. Once everything was ready, he bundled himself in layers of clothing and stepped outside into the silence. The air had a knife-edge sharpness that filled his lungs with a cold fiercer than anything inside his home could match. Jasper whined at the doorway, but Caleb shook his head. "Not this time," he murmured. The dog's place was here, safe. This journey had no room for four-legged loyalties. He started walking, each step crunching crisply as he headed toward the rise where the rails had been exposed. Overnight, snowfall had partly covered his previous tracks, but he recognized the disturbed ground. When he uncovered the rails again, the metal glinted faintly in the newborn sun. He looked down the line stretching out ahead, leading into the distant hills. He imagined the voices of countless men who had once traveled the same path, dragged or forced into trains that never returned. The thought churned uneasily in his stomach. He swallowed, set his jaw, and started walking. The rails guided him across the flat expanse like a compass needle locked on a single truth. The tundra was not forgiving land. Snowdrifts sometimes swallowed the tracks entirely, forcing him to kick or sweep aside the powder to reorient himself. In other places, the rails jutted above the ground, warped slightly where permafrost had buckled over the years. But always they continued forward, unwavering, impenetrably direct. The longer he followed them, the quieter the world seemed to grow. Even the wind seemed subdued, as if reluctant to disturb a path that had been haunted by too many secrets already. Caleb's breath billowed in clouds that disappeared quickly behind him, erased by the cold before they could form a trail. Hours passed. His legs ached from the uneven ground and the heavy gear strapped to his back. Each time he stopped to rest, he would glance behind him and see nothing but an unbroken stretch of white leading back to familiar safety. Ahead, the hills rose steadily, a jagged skyline that promised shelter and yet seemed to loom like the battlements of a fortress. By midday, the sun had risen to its apex, a shallow arc that cast long, sharp shadows despite the hour. Caleb paused near a place where the snow had drifted high against a series of wooden poles. When he brushed away more snow, he uncovered the remains of what must have once been a communications line. Old glass insulators clung to the wood, pale blue and cracked by the cold. Some wires still hung, frayed but stubbornly intact, swaying slightly in the frigid breeze. These signs of infrastructure made something tighten in his chest. This had not been an abandoned experiment or a temporary route meant to be forgotten. It was constructed with purpose, guarded, maintained. Someone had invested power and money and manpower into building this rail line into the heart of nowhere. The cold began to bite through his boots by the time he moved on. He sipped coffee, letting its heat flow through him. He had expected the wilderness, but this space felt different. Not wild exactly, more like land that had been claimed then deliberately erased. He noticed marks in the snow then. Tracks, not the pads of wolves or the hoof prints of moose. These prints were geometric, patterned with ridges, human-made. A snowmobile or a tracked vehicle modern, not something from his grandfather's lifetime. Caleb crouched and studied them. They weren't fresh enough to suggest immediate danger, but they were recent. A few days old, perhaps less. Someone else had been following this same path. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing. No motion but the wind. Yet the threat now felt real, a shadow that could not be brushed from the back of his neck. Government surveyors? Security personnel? People whose job it was to ensure the rail stayed forgotten? His heart thudded harder. The weight of the camera in his pack became both comfort and responsibility. If there was danger ahead, then proof of what he found might be the only shield he had. Another hour, another stretch of relentless walking. The hills finally rose high enough to block some of the wind. Caleb welcomed the slight relief, though the climb tested his endurance. When he crested one of the slopes, he froze mid-step. Below him, nestled in a gentle basin, like a scar attempting to hide itself, stood the first unmistakable sign of something enormous. A chain-link fence ran in a perfect rectangle along the ground. Though sections had fallen and the wiring lay buried in snow, the outline was clear. This had once been an enclosed perimeter, and beyond that perimeter, barely visible under heavy drifts, rose the faded shapes of buildings. Long roofs, plain structures. Functional, not comfortable. Barracks. His pulse quickened. He pulled off a glove and ran his bare fingers over the photograph he carried from his grandfather's box. Snow. Men in uniform standing in front of buildings just like these. The likeness between what he saw now and what Samuel Walker had stood in front of was too precise to dismiss. He descended the hill slowly, each step driven by equal parts dread and grim determination. Snow softened his footfalls into silence. When he reached the perimeter fence, he brushed aside the hoarfrost and rust flakes and felt the cold bite of the metal beneath. It had not been touched in years, maybe decades, and yet the design felt recent enough to be recognizable. Razor wire lay tangled nearby, though its blades were dulled by time. He moved quietly, scanning for anything out of place. His breath came faster. The fence had been cut near one corner, a small opening torn wide enough for a single person to slip through. He hesitated before ducking inside, half expecting an alarm to blare or footsteps to rush toward him. But the camp remained as still as a frozen photograph. The structures rose around him now, shadows in white, like tombstones marking lives forgotten. Some walls had collapsed entirely, others stood defiant against the decades. The air held a strange reverence, as though the place insisted on being remembered in silence, if not in story. Caleb advanced deeper, one cautious step after another. His boots disturbed untouched snow untouched, except for one thing. He noticed fresh impressions near one building's entrance. The marks were crisp, edges clean. Someone had stepped here recently. Very recently. He swallowed hard, feeling his heartbeat thud like drum beats in a funeral procession. The building itself loomed ahead, a long barrack with small windows high on the walls. The door had been torn partially off its hinges, hanging lopsided like a broken jaw. Beyond it stretched a darkness that seeped out into the daylight, as though the shadows themselves wanted to cling to anyone who dared enter. Caleb's hand trembled slightly when he reached for his flashlight, but he forced himself to steady it. He had come too far. He needed answers. Each second he delayed only fed the fear circling inside him. He stepped through the doorway. The air inside was colder, somehow heavier. His flashlight beam cut across rows of narrow metal bed frames. Some still held the remnants of old mattresses, fabric torn and stained. Others lay twisted and mangled, as if in the final days of the camp, chaos had turned violent. Faint scrawls, names, tallies of days, words in languages he didn't recognize, covered some of the wooden walls. He brushed his gloved hand across them, feeling the ghost of voices pressed into the surface by desperation. He whispered without meaning to, "What happened to you all?" There was no answer, only the distant creak of settling structures, a reminder that despite the silence, the world still moved. He backed away and exited into the light again, breathing in the cold air greedily. His mind swirled with images, his grandfather standing proudly or reluctantly in front of structures just like these, men sleeping and waking here, working until the elements or radiation or brutality took them. The rail line had brought them here, and now it had brought him. He turned to follow the tracks deeper into the facility. The rails no longer served a passenger car, but instead ran directly toward the heart of the camp, toward something far more ominous. The hill he had crested was no longer behind him in the same way. He couldn't return the same man he had been before. Knowledge had begun its transformation into responsibility. With every step he took forward, Caleb felt more certain of two things. First, that there was more to discover truth, thick and suffocating, buried beneath layers of snow and classified lies. And second, that he was not alone in wanting to find it. The rails continued deeper into the facility, and he followed, feeling the weight of every footstep drawing him further from the life he once knew, further into the past that refused to stay dead. The barracks stood silent behind him as he walked, but he could not mistake the sensation rising like winter chill along his spine. This place was watching him, and somewhere out in the vast white distance, someone else was walking too. The silence of the camp lingered around Caleb like a thick, suffocating blanket, muffling every sound but the steady thumping of his own heartbeat. It felt as though even the wind refused to intrude on this forsaken place, leaving only the weight of memory dark and unspoken to press against him from all sides. He stood in the open space between the barracks and the rise of the land ahead. The rails, half buried in frost and snow, trailed onward through the center of the camp before curving slightly to follow the contour of the ground. They seemed to beckon him deeper, as if they too remembered what they once carried. Caleb took a step forward, then another. He was aware, painfully aware, of how alone he was. Each crunch of snow beneath his boots felt too loud, a violation against a graveyard's quiet. He rubbed his gloved hands together and breathed out into the sharp air. His breath faded instantly, leaving behind no trace that he had ever been there. The land here swallowed evidence the same way it had swallowed the truth. The rails descended gradually, leading him toward a break in the ground where the earth fell away. As he neared the edge, his eyes widened. There in a steep ravine below, frozen as though the world had paused mid-catastrophe, was a train car, or what remained of one. Its steel frame twisted, one end biting into the earth, while the other clawed upward, reaching like a rusted hand toward the gray sky. Snow blanketed the wreck, but parts of the darkened metal still showed through, a stubborn reminder of what this machine had been built for. For a moment, Caleb simply stared. He had expected something, anything, but not this, not a sight so violently final. He felt as though he were gazing upon the last frozen scream of a story that had never been allowed to end. Slowly, cautiously, he began to descend into the ravine. The slope was treacherous, patches of ice lurking beneath loose snow, threatening to pull him down faster than he intended. He used his hands to steady himself, occasionally gripping bare rock or twisted shrub roots that jutted out like bones. Halfway down, he paused to catch his breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The wreck loomed larger now. Jagged metal tore through the surrounding ice like something buried alive trying desperately to break the surface. The nearer he came, the more he recognized details his mind already feared. Thick steel bars along the windows, heavy hinges reinforced with rivets that did not belong to passenger travel, and a door torn wide near the center bent outward, as if forced open from within, a prison on tracks. Caleb reached the base of the car and ran one hand along the rust-scarred exterior. It felt brutally cold, colder than the air around it, as though the metal itself retained some memory of the darkness it had contained. He found the torn doorway, took a breath that tasted of dread and iron, and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the odor, faint, almost non-existent after so many years, but still lingering, the sour scent of rust and rot and something far more human. His flashlight beam cut through the dimness, illuminating narrow aisles that ran between rows of metal bunks welded directly to the walls. Shackles dangled from some of the frames, frozen mid-swing, tiny flakes of rust falling like dust from the lightest touch. He moved deeper. The car swallowed his light, absorbing it into shadows that seemed unwilling to let go. Chains hung from the ceiling in regular intervals, some broken, some clasped shut as though their last prisoner had been taken away still bound. He could see scratches carved into the metal walls, some shallow, some deep, nails bent and broken against steel in an effort to leave a message that would outlive bone and breath. He reached up to trace a pattern of marks, letting his fingertips glide over the indentations. They weren't letters. They were tallies. Days counted, hopelessly or defiantly etched by hands that had likely trembled from cold or fear or sickness. 38 tallies in one place, more than 100 in another. Some clusters so large he couldn't instantly comprehend how long the person had survived here before disappearing into whatever nightmare awaited them at the end of the tracks. This car had moved. It had transported people to this place, and now it lay here like a tomb. Caleb's throat tightened. The horror of it pressed against his ribs until it felt difficult to breathe. The image of his grandfather in that old photograph returned sharply to his mind. Samuel standing in front of a similar structure, men in uniforms behind him, buildings like barracks, rail lines, cold, snow, silence. How deeply had his grandfather been involved? Had he walked through cars like this? Had he looked prisoners in the eye? Had he justified it to himself? Or had he spent the rest of his life trying to forget? Near the front of the car, Caleb's light caught something on the floor. He crouched and brushed snow and dirt away until a small piece of metal emerged from beneath. He turned it over carefully. A rectangular tag, the size of a dog tag but thicker, stamped with a number. No name, no nationality, just a number and a series of letters that meant nothing to him at first glance. He tucked the tag into his jacket, a cold shiver running down his spine. Whatever tragedy had ended here did not die quietly. It had left traces, too many to dismiss, too many to rationalize away. He thought again of the tracks he'd seen earlier, fresh tracks made by machines. If someone was still coming here, if someone was still cautious enough to monitor this place, then the truth about this camp was far from buried. It was merely kept on a leash. A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A pop of shifting ice or something heavier? Caleb held his breath, listening. The stillness returned. He reminded himself that ice moved unpredictably under temperature changes, especially with the broken steel weighing into the frozen ground. Yet the awareness of vulnerability gnawed at him. He checked behind him, sweeping the light over the wreck interior. Nothing but shadow and ruin. He decided it was time to move deeper into the facility. He climbed out of the ravine with even more caution than before. When he reached level ground again, he paused, turning to gaze once more at the train car. It looked smaller now, but somehow more tragic. It had been a device of control once. Now it was a silent witness. He continued to follow the rails, each step resonating with imagined echoes of countless others who had taken this walk unwillingly. The tracks cut straight to a low building with double doors reinforced by steel plates. A faded stenciling on the metal might once have identified the structure, but it was now too scoured by time to read. Caleb placed a hand against the door and pushed lightly. It gave way with surprising ease, swinging inward with a soft whine. His flashlight illuminated a narrow corridor with rooms branching off to either side. Each room held rows of metal bunks, but these were different from the barracks he'd already seen. The bunks in this place were affixed to walls in cramped cells. Heavy locks hung broken on some doors. Others remained intact, rust fused to rust. More tallies scratched into surfaces, more silent testimonies to suffering. Caleb tried to imagine what it must have been like. The cold, the fear, the endless days under guard. The knowledge there was no escape. He imagined faces he would never know, voices begging in languages never recorded in any report. He imagined the despair that took root here, and how it might have driven some to carve their final thoughts into steel. At the far end of the building, he found something worse than he expected. A room without bunks, without windows, without air. Just 4 steel walls and scratch marks covering every inch of the interior. Panic surged in his throat. He shut the door gently, a gesture of respect for whoever had been entombed inside those walls. Back in the corridor, he steadied himself, drawing slow breaths. This place wasn't merely a camp. It was a designed instrument of disappearance, built to consume lives without leaving graves behind. His legs felt heavier as he continued onward. He found another structure partly collapsed on one end. It was larger than the barracks, with remnants of desks, filing cabinets tipped over and emptied, as though someone had hastily cleared out anything identifiable before abandoning the facility. Dotted across the walls were peeling charts and faded warning signs about hazardous materials. He snapped photographs of everything he could, knowing these images might soon be all that remained. The building's back door half open, hanging crookedly led straight to a path that sloped downward. At its end, carved into the hillside, was a dark mouth, the entrance to a mine shaft. Caleb stopped at the threshold. Cold radiated from the opening, deeper and more intense than the chill outside. The air smelled faintly of minerals and old dust. He raised his flashlight and peered into the blackness. The beam didn't reach far, swallowed by the void as if the earth itself had secrets it wasn't ready to share. Behind him, the camp stood frozen. Ahead of him, darkness waited. He knew that he couldn't stop here. If he walked away now, the story would remain incomplete, just as the world had wanted it to be for decades. The tracks had led him this far, step by step, pulling him deeper into a narrative written in blood and buried in ice. Caleb inhaled shakily. He touched the dog tag in his pocket, feeling the embossed numbers burn like a brand against his fingertips. Then he tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward into the tunnel. The air grew stiller. His footsteps echoed softly, as if the earth around him listened. And in that hush, he could no longer deny it. What he was exploring was not simply history. It was a crime that had never ended, a past that was not done reaching into the present. And as Caleb moved deeper into the mine, he understood that he had crossed a threshold. Whatever lay ahead would change him. Whatever he found next would not easily let him go. The deeper Caleb walked into the mine, the more the cold changed. Outside, the cold was sharp and honest, carved from a wind and distance. Here beneath the earth, it felt heavier, dense, and lifeless, as if the air itself remembered the final breaths of those who had once been trapped inside. The tunnel was a brutal straight line into darkness, supported by old timber beams crusted with frost and dust. His flashlight made the shadows leap like startled animals against the rough walls. His footsteps echoed irregularly, swallowed and returned by the stone passages in uneven whispers. This place had been carved by human hands, broken, bleeding hands that had no choice in the matter. He could almost sense them near him in the heavy silence. Men coughing from dust and radiation. Men too weak to stand but forced to swing pickaxes anyway, their sweat freezing on their skin moments after it formed. He tried to shake the images out of his mind, but they clung like burrs. He pulled his jacket tighter and took another step. He wasn't far from the surface. The faint crunch of snow outside still echoed dimly behind him, but the tunnel curved downward soon after, hedging him in. His breath sounded too loud. He kept moving because stopping felt like an invitation to the dark to swallow him completely. After 100 yards or more, the passage widened into an underground chamber. His light swept slowly across the space. Wooden rails, much smaller than the ones outside, ran through the dirt and rock, or carts once moved along this narrow line, pulled by hands that trembled from hunger. Tools lay abandoned in piles, shovels bent from strain, picks worn down to stubs, gloves stiff as boards. A rusted wheelbarrow sat tipped on its side, fossilized by years of neglect. He knelt, touching the handle of a pickaxe. The metal felt strange beneath his glove, almost greasy, though it was surely only the residue of decades in human history clinging to it. He imagined someone collapsing mid-swing, their body carted away like a broken tool, and replaced before the overseers could count the cost. Every object felt sacred and tragic, the remnants of labor that had stolen lives. When he stood again, he noticed a wooden crate pushed against one wall. Its faded stenciling nearly vanished, but when he brushed a section clean, a skull symbol with rays, an old radiation hazard marking, revealed itself. His throat tightened. He traced the faded label and then lowered his flashlight beam. The earth beneath the crate glowed faintly green. Not bright, not surreal, just the faintest shimmer, enough to make his skin crawl. He didn't need a Geiger counter to know what it meant. Uranium ore, left to rot in a forgotten chamber under the tundra. He stepped back quickly, instinctively avoiding prolonged exposure. The prisoners worked here. They inhaled this air, drank this water, slept near these minerals. Some must have died without ever knowing what killed them. Caleb's stomach churned. This wasn't just forced labor. It was a death sentence disguised as industry. A tunnel branched off to the left. The rails continued that way. Though dread pulled at him, curiosity, the same stubborn force that had dragged him here, pushed harder. He followed. The air grew colder still. Soon he reached another chamber, larger, shaped like a staging area. Columns of old lockers stood in rows, many pried open long ago. Uniform remnants lay inside some, patches ripped off. Barrels stacked against the far wall were labeled in red letters. Property of U.S. Army. The date beneath, 1952. His pulse jumped. This was not a civilian mining site. This had been a military operation, and not one they ever wanted recorded. A desk stood near the center, its surface littered with moldering papers. Caleb approached, careful not to disturb too much. The top sheet had smudged ink, but he deciphered enough to turn his blood cold. Transport schedule, Group 14. Arrival, 47 prisoners. Departure, NA. Below that, Group 15. Arrival, 52 prisoners. Departure, NA. There were dozens of lines like those. No departure numbers, no one ever left. He took photos, every angle, every paper. These documents deserved daylight. The world deserved to see them. He nearly missed the door to the side office, partly hidden by a collapsed beam. He squeezed through the narrow opening. His flashlight revealed a room with cracked tiles and rusted equipment that once might have served as a medical station if one used medical generously. Metal restraints bolted to tables, instruments that gleamed too sharp in the light, cabinets forced open, their contents spilled like a surgeon's nightmare. A journal lay on the floor. He picked it up carefully. The leather cover was stiff, but still intact. Flipping to a random page, he found words written in a desperate hand. Day 121. The coughing worsens. They tell us we must continue. They say it is for victory. We know they lie. The air hurts to breathe. Some men collapse and never rise. The guards wear masks. We wear nothing. May God remember us if the world will not. Caleb closed the journal too quickly. A bitter lump lodged in his throat. He pressed a hand against his mouth to steady himself. These were not criminals. These were not enemies. They were resources, sacrifices of Cold War fear and greed. Whoever ran this operation had buried not only bodies but evidence, conscience, and accountability. He forced himself to continue on, The mine shafts extended deeper. Somewhere in this labyrinth, the truth weighted more truths than any official history book ever admitted. His breath echoed harshly as he pushed forward. Eventually, the tunnel took a turn upward. He followed it with relief building slowly in his chest, imagining that fresh air might be close. But what greeted him instead was worse than any underground horror. He emerged behind a fortified steel structure, not a mine building, but something designed for control. A guard tower loomed above the entrance, its metal staircase twisted and rusted, but unmistakably militaristic. Through cracks in the wall, he saw glimpses of the camp from a higher vantage. Fencing, barracks, that wrecked train car, it all connected. A complete machine of suffering. But most alarming was what lay just inside the gate of this fortified structure. A line of heavy-duty floodlights, newer than anything else he'd seen. And cameras. Modern cameras. Black, sleek, functional. A silent alarm system that did not match the age of the camp. Someone was not only guarding the past, someone was still visiting it. He ducked instinctively, pressing himself flat against the cold metal. His breath fogged unevenly as he peeked around the edge. No movement, no guards. But the evidence was undeniable: recent maintenance, fresh circuits, cables that led underground. This place was not simply forgotten after all. It was being monitored. His next steps were hurried, fueled by adrenaline and unease. He skirted the guard tower and moved deeper into the administrative area. Filing drawers thrown open, maps pinned to corkboards, their edges curled with age but still readable if he got close enough. He snapped more photos, every detail a dagger against the silence that had smothered this history for decades. Another building caught his attention, a larger one with double doors reinforced by steel. The snow around it was disturbed, footprints partially filled in by new snowfall, but unmistakable. Whoever made them came not long ago. Caleb swallowed dry fear. He weighed his options. He could turn back now, take what he had learned, and get out. The evidence was already damning, but he knew he couldn't stop while the truth remained incomplete. He approached the doors. One hung slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, the air hit him first. Stale, like breath trapped in lungs that no longer worked. And then he saw the beds. Not bunks, hospital beds, dozens of them in neat rows, all stripped, save for straps restraints still buckled at the corners. He stepped forward on trembling legs. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crawled over his skin. This wasn't a medical facility. It was a death ward. He found more tags here, like the one he had taken earlier. Only these lay scattered across the floor, some half buried in dust. Tags without names. Identities stripped away before even death could claim them. He knelt, gathered several, and tucked them into his pack. Each one a silent accusation pointed at a nation that had pretended this never happened. He noticed a heavy door in the back. The warning label on it was barely visible. Isolation. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what would lie behind it before he even reached out. And yet his hand moved anyway, driven by the same force that had brought him miles through frozen wilderness to this forbidden truth. Inside were small rooms, windowless, soundless. Some still contained shackles. Scratches marred every surface. The air smelled of fear so old it had fossilized. He staggered back, dizzy with horror. He had seen enough. More than enough. The truth screamed from every corner, every object, every silent echo of agony. But then something else caught his attention. A light. Not from his flashlight. A faint glow. A green dot blinking softly near the floor. Almost hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. He crouched and brushed the debris aside. A motion sensor. New. Active. Caleb froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. He was not alone. He backed out of the room, staying low. The camp was no longer a relic. It was a trap disguised as history. Someone was still guarding whatever remained, and he had just tripped the alarm. He ran. He didn't care about silence anymore. Every instinct roared move. Snow crunched violently as he sprinted, his breath ripping through the air. He had to get out, get distance, get back to Jasper, back to someone, anyone who could help carry this truth. He didn't look back, but he could feel the gaze of the cameras like ice on his neck. The rails led toward daylight. He focused on them like lifelines, boots pounding in desperate rhythm. When the cold wind finally stung his face again, he gasped, grateful for the open sky, however harsh. He didn't stop until the camp was no longer in sight. But even out here, even with nothing but snow in all directions, he felt hunted. Someone knew he had come. Someone would follow. The truth was no longer buried, and now the people who had buried it were coming for him. Caleb did not remember the exact moment when running turned into surviving. The tundra seemed to stretch forever behind him, the wind a relentless force pushing at his back as if urging him to flee faster. He didn't dare look over his shoulder, not because he thought no one was following, but because he was terrified someone was. Every sound, the snap of a twig beneath his boot, the distant crack of shifting ice, seemed magnified into a warning that he was not alone anymore. He crested a ridge and finally dared to stop, chest heaving, sweat prickling against his freezing skin. He turned and scanned the endless white. Nothing. Yet the absence of visible threat meant nothing. He had seen functioning cameras, a blinking motion sensor, fresh tire tracks in the snow. The people who monitored that camp were equipped. They were trained, and they ranked above any local law enforcement that might have helped him. He trudged on, trying to quiet the panic roaring in his ribs. The sun dipped lower, smearing faint light along the horizon. It would be night soon, and temperatures would drop fast. He had to get home before dark, especially now, when home might already be watched. Jasper barked when Caleb approached the ranch, a short, clipped sound that carried both relief and alarm. The dog paced anxiously near the fence, ears flattened. Caleb tried to calm his own breathing and forced himself to walk instead of sprint the rest of the way. He didn't want to look like prey. Inside, he immediately shut the curtains and turned off the lights. He kept only a dim lamp glowing near the far corner of the room as he sank down onto the kitchen chair. His legs trembled with exhaustion. His hands shook when he reached for the camera in his pack. He connected it to his laptop, and the screen came alive with the evidence he had gathered: photos of the rails, the barracks, the train, the mining equipment, the journals, the tags stripped of identities. Each image punched deeper into him, proof of atrocities committed under the guise of national security. A buried chapter the government had chosen to forget, or rather, chosen to hide. The files loaded slowly, each one a scream caught in silence. He sat in the shadows of the kitchen and listened for any sound beyond his walls. The ranch was too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. He remembered the motion sensor in that facility, an alert likely sent the moment he stepped into that isolation room. They had his face on the camera, his clothing, his size, his direction of travel. They knew. Fear tightened around him like a steel trap. He reached for the phone, intending to call someone, maybe the state police, or the nearest ranger station, but his finger froze above the keypad. What would he say? That he had found a secret military labor camp where prisoners had died mining uranium decades ago, and that someone was still monitoring it. Without proof in multiple hands, the information would disappear into a drawer labeled classified, and he might disappear along with it. He lowered the phone and let his hand drop heavily onto the table. Then he noticed something. Among the scattered files from the camera, the screen showed another image. A photograph he hadn't taken. A scan of an official memo. The watermark faint beneath the words. He clicked it to enlarge. Project L91, personnel log. Location, Camp Echo. Status, active personnel on site until clearance achieved. His eyes locked on the name listed third from the top. Samuel Walker. His breath caught painfully. His grandfather. The man who raised him. The man who told him never to follow rails in the snow. The man who died with regrets carved into the furrows of his face. Samuel had been stationed here. He had lived and breathed the silence of this place, and he had tried to keep Caleb away from the truth because he knew the truth demanded a price. Caleb's hands drifted toward the small wooden box he had left open on the counter last night. He lifted the dog tag inside, letting in lamplight catch the tarnished metal. A voice recording from years ago echoed in his memory, his grandfather's rare moment of candor when illness had loosened his grip on secrets. Some things stay buried because they must. Some truths only destroy. Caleb had always thought Samuel was speaking about grief. Now he knew it was guilt. and fear. He snapped back to the present when Jasper's ears suddenly perked, nose lifting toward the door. The dog growled low in warning. Caleb froze. Outside, a soft crunch passed near the porch boots pressing down on snow. Someone was approaching. His pulse spiked violently. He reached for the gun by the fridge, the same stub-nosed shotgun he used to frighten off wolves, but his hands trembled too much to load it with anything but blanks. Still, holding it made him feel less helpless. The footsteps moved around the house, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder was inspecting or marking points of entry. Caleb held his breath and crouched low beneath the window, gripping the shotgun tighter. He dared a sideways glance through a gap in the curtain. A figure in a heavy parka, face obscured, walked past the edge of the porch. Another figure joined him, speaking into a radio, words muffled by the wind, but carrying unmistakable intent. They weren't lost travelers. They weren't neighbors. They were searching, finding. The house suddenly felt far too small, too vulnerable. Caleb's heart hammered in his ears. Jasper pressed against his leg, silent now but tense as a drawn bow. Caleb backed away from the window and headed for the back door as quietly as he could. He had to find a way out before they surrounded the ranch completely. He slipped into his boots and jacket, grabbed the camera and the dog tag, and stuffed them into his bag. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, their complaint too loud in the suffocating silence. When he cracked the back door open, a blast of icy air hit his face, clearing his mind in a shock of determination. The night outside was terrifyingly vast, but it was better than staying here trapped. He signaled Jasper to follow and slipped out, closing the door gently behind him. Snow muffled his steps as he crept around the side of the house, cutting a wide arc away from the approaching strangers. He kept to the shadows of the barn and storage shed, heart pounding relentlessly. He made it to the tree line just as a harsh beam of a flashlight sliced across the yard behind him. A voice barked an order he couldn't fully make out, but the tension in the tone was unmistakable. They'd found signs of movement. They'd enter the house next. Caleb didn't stop moving until he reached the cover of the forest. There, hidden by the dark silhouettes of trees, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He set his eyes toward town, toward the only person he could think to trust with this. Tom Carrion, a journalist friend of his mother's from the Stanhope Gazette, smart, persistent, and most importantly, someone who didn't trust government promises. If anyone could help him reveal the truth before it was buried again, it was Tom. The trek to town would be long and punishing through the snow, especially at night, but fear drove him harder than exhaustion could hold him back. Jasper stayed pressed to his side, a silent guardian. Behind him, the lights of his ranch glowed faintly, shadows flickering inside the windows. He knew that when those men stormed inside, they'd find nothing. Not him, not Jasper, not the files. But they would know he was running, and they would follow. He turned his back fully to the ranch and trudged forward into the night, following the rails only when he had to. Each step was a vow. He would not let this truth die out here where no one cared to look. He would carry it into daylight, even if he had to drag it with the last of his strength. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, dawn approached, turning the horizon faintly blue. His legs trembled from fatigue, his fingers stung with cold. Jasper panted heavily at his side, muzzle dusted with frost. But they reached Tom's door, and Caleb pounded his fist against it with what little strength he had left. Moments later, the door swung open. Tom's surprise turned to alarm as he took in Caleb's condition. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he whispered, dragging him inside. Caleb dropped his bag heavily on the table. "They're coming," he breathed, "and there isn't much time." The truth had finally found daylight, and daylight, unlike snow, did not forgive buried sins. For the first time in what felt like hours, Caleb let himself sink into a chair, though every muscle in his body screamed against the motion. The warm air inside Tom's house began to thaw the cold that had settled deep into his bones, and the sensation hurt, pins and needles stabbing his fingers and toes as feeling returned. Jasper curled near his feet, the dog's breath shallow but steady. Tom moved quickly, locking the door behind them, then returned with a thick blanket and wrapped it around Caleb's shoulders. "You look like you crawled out of a snowdrift." Tom muttered as he poured steaming coffee into a mug. His attempt at humor came out tight, his eyes betraying the concern he didn't voice. Talk to me, slowly. What happened? Caleb cupped the mug between trembling hands and tried to find words in the chaos of his thoughts. The camp is real, he said finally, his voice hoarse. All of it. The prison train, the mines, the barracks. They worked men to death there, Tom, and someone is still watching the place. The memory of blinking sensors and modern cameras returned like a slap of cold air. Still guarding whatever secrets they buried under that ice. Tom dragged a chair up beside him. We knew something was out there, but you're saying it's more than just abandoned infrastructure. I'm saying it's a crime scene, Caleb whispered. A grave site. A government operation so dark they erased every name, every identity, every record. They made people disappear and then pretended they never existed. He pulled the camera and documents from his pack and pushed them toward Tom. The journalist began sorting through the files, the flashlight images casting grim clarity across his laptop screen. He reviewed each photograph with growing disbelief. Rusted shackles, tally marks carved into bunks and walls, sealed rooms with restraints, tags without names. Jesus. This is... Tom rubbed a hand over his face. This could change everything. It already has, Caleb said. They're after me. They know I went there. They came to the ranch. I don't think they're going to stop until they get all of this back. And silence you, Tom added quietly. That truth sat heavy between them. Jasper whined softly, picking up on their tension. Tom took a slow breath, then opened his laptop and plugged in the flash drive. We have to go public. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. Caleb nodded. He had already chosen this road the moment he stepped into the tunnel beneath the camp. There was no turning back now. While Tom scanned documents and uploaded files to cloud servers and external backups, Caleb paced the small kitchen. His body still ached from the journey, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He knew the people who guarded that place would not allow this information to surface. The game had moved past subtle intimidation. The next move would be violent. When the uploads finished, Tom sat back. Once I hit publish, there's no hiding, he warned. This story's going to explode. Names, logs, photos, coordinates. We're pointing a spotlight at a secret someone buried for 60 years. And if we don't, Caleb replied, I'm as good as dead anyway. Tom didn't argue. Instead, he typed a final line on the news post and hovered over the send command. He looked up at Caleb. Ready? Caleb thought of the prisoners who had carved days into steel, of the journal entries filled with pain and dying hope, of his grandfather's warning, etched not into walls but into Caleb's life, meant to protect him from exactly this path, and yet some truths demanded to be spoken, no matter the cost. Do it, he said. Tom clicked. A heartbeat of silence passed. Then notifications pinged rapid fire across the screen as the story went live, picked up instantly by automated feeds and sharing algorithms hungry for scandal. The truth that had once been frozen in a forgotten corner of Alaska was now spreading faster than any official silence could smother. Caleb exhaled shakily and lowered into the chair. For a moment he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be enough. The illusion lasted less than a minute. The house lights flickered. A distant engine rumbled outside. Jasper jumped to his feet, ears pointed, tail stiffened. Tom shot Caleb a glance filled with fear and certainty. They tracked you here. Caleb grabbed his pack, but before either man could reach the back door, a pounding explosion shook the front entrance, someone forcing their way inside. Splinters flew as the door burst open, and two men in heavy winter tactical gear stepped through, weapons raised. In the name of federal authority, stand down, one barked. Their voices were too calm, too practiced. Tom instinctively stepped in front of Caleb. This is public record now, he shouted. You can't bury this again. The agent closest to them leveled his rifle. On the contrary, he said, we always bury what threatens national security. For a terrifying moment, the world narrowed into the barrel pointed directly at Caleb's chest. Every breath froze. Every thought pounded inside his skull. Then a shout came from outside another vehicle skidding up the road, and over the roaring tension, flashing lights flooded through the broken doorway. Local police stormed in with far more uncertainty than their adversaries, but they came armed and shouting commands. The agents turned, caught off guard enough that a single standoff formed. The tension was a coiled spring ready to snap. One of the federal men stepped close to Caleb. "You think this is over?" he murmured. "That post will disappear the moment we make a call, and you with it." Caleb met his eyes. Fear surged through him, but so did resolve deeper than fear. "Even if they erase the first," he whispered back, "there are backups. People already downloading. You can't stop the story anymore." The agent's expression turned to cold fury. But the standoff shifted. Police demanded surrender. Neighbors recorded on their phones from their porches. The agents, assessing risk, retreated reluctantly out the back, disappearing into the night like shadows that refused to leave scars, not ones visible to the world. When they left, police swarmed Tom's house questions, radios, too many people in too small a space. Tom answered what he could. Caleb remained silent, hands shaking. Within hours, national outlets were contacting Tom's editor. Government officials released statements denying any knowledge. Human rights groups demanded immediate investigations. A senator called for hearings. The world cracked open, just enough for the truth to breathe. By sunset, Caleb was escorted home under protection to retrieve what little he could from the ranch. The agents hadn't returned, but the damage to the property showed how close he'd come to disappearing like the others. Jasper stuck to him like a shadow, refusing to let Caleb leave his sight. The following day, Tom drove Caleb to see Mabel at the hospital, not dead, not vanished, but shaken and bruised. She squeezed Caleb's hand and only said, "Sometimes the ground remembers more than those who walk upon it. I'm proud you made it remember aloud." Her voice nearly broke him. Days passed. Reports multiplied. Caleb's evidence spread like wildfire. People began demanding answers. Descendants of those who never came home. Survivors once silenced by shame or threats. And the government, backed into a corner, announced an official investigation into Camp Echo, Project L91, and the uranium operations conducted during the early Cold War. The truth had not triumphed, not yet, but it lived, it breathed. One evening, as the first hints of spring thaw softened the edges of the snow, Caleb returned to the tundra alone. He brought with him a wooden post he'd carved by hand. He followed the rails not all the way to the camp, not anymore, but to a small rise where the land opened wide and silent. He planted the post firmly in the ground. Jasper sat beside him, watching. Caleb stepped back, letting his gaze soften. The wood bore just 3 words burned deep into its surface. "This land remembers." He stood there long enough for the sky to shift into deep violet, stars appearing one by one, like sparks from the past refusing to fade. The wind whispered through the emptiness around him, but it no longer sounded like warning. It sounded like acknowledgement. He would carry the consequences of his choice for the rest of his life, but he would also carry the memory of every soul who had been erased, every number who deserved a name, every truth that had clawed its way to light through decades of snow and silence. Before turning back, he gave one last look toward the horizon where the old rails disappeared into dusk. They were no longer a path toward secrets. They were a path toward justice. And though the price had been steep, the truth no longer rusted beneath the ice. It was free. Before you go, don't let this be the last mystery you uncover today. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the truth they tried to bury. Smash that like button if this story kept you on edge. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in his place? I read every reply. Share this video with someone who loves dark secrets and hidden history, because the next unbelievable discovery is already on its way. Watch the next episode. It's even more shocking.